Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the PowerPoint in the week 1 module on the rhetorical situation, what is rhetoric? So we're looking through the PowerPoint. Our first slide after the title slide asks us, what is rhetoric? You've probably heard the word before. I think I even mentioned it in the first PowerPoint on what is argument. We're going to talk about it a little more in depth in this PowerPoint because it is a very important aspect of argument. So what is rhetoric? It is the process of using the most effective strategies to influence thought. Aristotle defined it as the ability to use whatever means of persuasion for any given case. So it's persuasion. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. And that can mean so many different things. Persuasion is something that can be very subtle, and it can run the spectrum all the way up to something that is super obvious. But persuasion is a cornerstone of communication. So really, rhetoric is what we use to persuade people, to influence them, to change their opinions. But rhetoric also refers to the study of how people are persuaded and influenced. So if you understand the how, then you can use that yourself, right? You don't have to. Sometimes people just study rhetoric simply to learn what influences people, what persuades them, how does it work, right? How are certain people able to exert influence over others through language, just through speaking, right? How are advertising companies able to garner so much business, right? So it's the study of how people are persuaded, and then if you choose, you can use that knowledge to then persuade people yourself. And that's kind of what we're going to be doing throughout the quarter. We're going to be learning how people are persuaded, and then you're going to be attempting an argumentative research paper where you're going to try to persuade people, right? So rhetoric asks questions like, what's happening? Who is present? Who's the audience? We want to know what their beliefs and values are. We want to know what kind of language appeals to those values and beliefs. Knowing the audience and knowing how language affects people is a huge part of rhetoric and argument. When we try to make a point seem reasonable or ethical or emotional for a particular audience, we're using rhetoric. We're involved in a rhetorical effort. And again, it can be very subtle, like how information is presented in a scientific report, or what kinds of details, what kinds of facts are included in a news report versus the facts or the details that aren't included, the ones that are left out. It can be very dramatic, a lawyer trying to persuade a jury, or politicians giving speeches, and it can be very obvious. Advertising. We're going to look a lot at advertising and posters and propaganda and things like that. It's solely based in rhetoric, in persuasion. So don't think that rhetoric is some fancy highbrow academic field of study. We all use rhetoric every day. We just might not pay much attention to it. We might not realize that's what it is, or that that's what we're using, or that that's what's being used on us. But, the goal of rhetoric is to examine language as it appears in essays, reports, literature, memos, policies, art, entertainment, and then even how people act, even in visuals like advertising, because advertising doesn't necessarily have to use words, right? So we do say it's the persuasiveness of language, but it's also the persuasiveness of images and what they evoke, the dialogue that they evoke within our minds and as a culture collectively. So rhetoric is key to understanding argument. In fact, there could be no argument without rhetoric. But I don't want you to confuse rhetoric with other things. When we talk about the rhetorical situation, people hear the word rhetorical and they sometimes get it confused with theoretical or hypothetical. Sometimes people hear the word rhetoric and they think, rhetorical question, which is a question that is asked, but nobody really is expecting you to answer it. It's just a question that's just thrown out there, tossed out there, left hanging. Some people hear the word rhetoric used in terms of like people who are just long-winded and keep talking and or maybe are dishonest. But really rhetoric is just the art of persuasion, and the rhetorical situation is taking a look at everything that is surrounding that argument. Whatever it is that we're trying to persuade the audience of or the reader of, what is happening around that moment or that text, that visual. If you think of like the visual or the essay itself right here, the rhetorical situation is everything that's happening around it. If you may have learned about it in Comp 1, thinking about the rhetorical situation when you go to write something or read something, you're thinking of what the specific topic is, what the angle is, what the purpose is, who the audience is, what the context is. And this rhetorical situation is very much, it stems from that same rhetorical situation that you may have learned about in Comp 1. Here, in terms of argument, we're thinking more about the argument itself, right? So the rhetorical situation is the thing that motivated the argument to occur. The time, the place, the circumstances, the reason that the argument exists. So we're going to look at all of those small elements. And one way we can do that is through what we call a trace analysis. Okay. Trace it's an acronym. So each letter stands for a different word, a different part of the analysis. If you remember what analysis means, analysis is looking at all the different parts to see how they work together to form the whole. So that's what a trace analysis is. We're going to look at all the different parts of an argument to see how they work together. But we're still kind of on the surface of the argument. We're not getting into the meat of the argument yet. Because we're still rhetorical. So right now we're still kind of on the outside. We are not critiquing or responding to an argument at this point. Again, we're on the outside. We're not diving into it yet. So remember that, here in the beginning, when we talk about a trace analysis, we are literally just objectively stepping away and analyzing different elements of the argument. Our job is not to say whether or not the argument was successful or if it failed. Our job is not to say whether or not we agree or disagree with the author. All of that we're saving for later. That's something different. This is just looking at certain elements of the argument in a very objective way. We want to simply understand the basic foundation of the argument. All right, so looking at the letters in the word trace, the first letter T stands for text, right? The argument itself. We say the word text, but it doesn't necessarily have to be written. It doesn't necessarily have to be like an essay or an article. It could be oral. It could be a speech or something in a debate or something in a discussion. It could be visual, an advertisement, a poster, some other sort of visual that is presenting a point of view, artwork. So we want to know about the text, what is it? Literally, describe it. The R is for reader or audience. Who is the targeted audience, right? So if what we're talking about is a speech that was given at a specific political convention, or a speech that was given in front of a troop of soldiers, or a speech that was given, on the Mall of America, things like that. Who was the targeted audience? And then how do you, as a reader, compare with the targeted audience? Or anybody, if it's, especially if it's not a contemporary text that we're working with, maybe it's something that, was written or occurred, 50, 75 years ago. How do we compare with the targeted audience? Do you think the audience was friendly? Do you think the audience was hostile to the original argument, to the arguer? Maybe they were undecided. Maybe they were on the fence about this issue that the argument is talking about. Maybe they were unfamiliar. Maybe this was new territory, right? Maybe they were neutral. Maybe they really didn't care one way or the other. Maybe they're linked, meaning the issue itself might not affect them directly, but there's, maybe part of it might affect them, or maybe they know someone, or maybe it would affect them in some way in a different part of their life. What kind of audience was the argument intended for, and what do we know about them, if anything, right? But knowing who the intended audience was can help us in later figuring out how the argument worked. The A in the trace analysis stands for author, right? What do we know about the author or the person presenting the argument, the arguer? Do we know anything about their background? Do we know anything about their experience or their education? Do we know anything about their affiliations? Political affiliations, religious affiliations, community affiliations, career, job affiliations? Do we know anything about their values? Do we know anything about their motivations? Because knowing this kind of information about the author tells us a lot about the choices they make in the progress of their argument, right? The C in the trace stands for constraints. This is probably the one that's the most difficult to understand out of the trace analysis. Constraints means anything that influences the audience. Constraints are our beliefs, our values, our attitudes, our interests, our habits, our perceptions, our associations. Anything that would cause the audience to react in a particular way. And did the author anticipate those? Were they aware of the constraints? Did they prepare for them? And then did the author check their own constraints? You know, we have our own perceptions and our own values and our own beliefs that influence us just as much. And, you know, if we're trying to persuade people of something, we're probably not being totally objective. We're still trying to get people to see our point of view. So what are our own constraints as we are presenting the argument? Constraints are simply the things that influence us. If this is a very, very obvious and dramatic example here, but if you had a child or a close loved one who has been a part of a school shooting, there will be certain constraints on you hearing or reading something that is about the Second Amendment, especially if it's, well, no, either way, whether it's, you know, in favor of the Second Amendment or in favor of some sort of gun law reform, you will have a particular reaction to that based on your experiences and your belief and your attitude, right? It's a very obvious example, but even in the most subtle ways, all of those things influence how we respond to persuasive measures. And then the E, let's go ahead and talk about more examples of constraints. I got that slide with there, sorry. This might help a little bit more too, yeah. So for instance, let's say we have one of our constraints is our mistrust of media, right? We feel that the media and reporters are liars, they exaggerate, we don't trust them. So if we're reading an essay, and in that essay, the author is praising how honest reporters are, how much integrity they have, we might be a little suspicious and we might not really buy into whatever this author is saying, right? Let's say we have we're going to resist whenever we're made to fear too much, right? Fearful resistance. So we have a famous biologist who's trying to persuade people that we are in the midst of an overpopulation crisis and we need to do something about it. And that might be a very valid argument that they're trying to make. Maybe the issue is super important and it really is something that we need to discuss. However, the way they present their point of view is by using a lot of just terribly catastrophic tone, and it's just so over the top. And, you know, we don't want to deal with anything that kind of makes us too fearful, that goes too far. So we just kind of, no thanks. Maybe we have no faith in politics or politicians. It's probably not a stretch for a lot of us. We have lost faith in our politicians, in our leaders. So we're probably not going to donate to a political campaign, are we? So any persuasive measures to try to get us to do so will probably fail. That's what we mean by constraints. What we go into it with as, you know, the audience or the reader that influence how effective the argument will be on us. The E in trace is for exigence. And if you think about the phrase exigent circumstances, it's what happened, right? Exigent circumstances means something kind of popped up and, something had to be done. What is the exigence for the argument? What is the reason for it? What happened to cause it? Why is it perceived as a problem or as something that needs to be discussed? Is it new? Is it recurring? What makes this argument relevant? Why should we care about it? What is going on in our lives, in the world right now that makes this argument worth discussing, right? So we put all that together, we have a trace analysis. And again, we're not really looking yet even at how the author is trying to persuade, what methods they're using. We're not even looking at any of that yet. We're still kind of circling the argument still. So on the next slide, after the slide on exigence, I have a picture here, a visual. So we're going to kind of look at a sample trace analysis with this visual argument. So here in the visual, we have former President Bill Clinton. He's in front of a group of Haitians. And he has promised he's pledged to donate $500,000 to rebuild a bridge in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, when it was damaged by an earthquake. It appeared as a standalone image in a national U.S. newspaper. How would you see this as argument? What kind of argument is being presented? How is it different from any other images that you might see of natural disaster areas? How does it affect you when you look at it and you know the context of the photo? Right? You can think about all those things, but if you go to the next slide, it actually goes through a sample trace analysis of this picture. So what is the text? T. It's a photograph from the earthquake zone in Haiti. It is printed in an American newspaper, and it depicts a former President Bill Clinton greeting residents of Port-au-Prince, Haiti. That's it. Just a very brief, objective description of the text. Who's the reader? Who was the intended audience? The targeted viewers are people in the United States, but also other parts of the world who might read this newspaper either online or in print, right? The photographer expects the audience to be interested in what is going on in Haiti in general, but also to show an interest in natural disasters of this sort. He would expect that the photographer would probably expect the audience to be sympathetic towards the Haitians and share his same values, to help others, those humanitarian values. So that is what the author, or in this case the photographer, that's what they're assuming about the audience. The author is a photographer who works for Getty Images, which is a major source of digital images used by news media, right? That's all we know about him. I mean, I'm sure we could find out more, but that's all we know right now. Constraints. What are some things, some attitudes or beliefs or values or prejudices that the audience might hold that could affect how they respond to this image? Well, the artist is constrained by the idea, what does he believe? What are his values going into this? He thinks that, natural disasters bring out our best impulses, that we naturally lend aid, that we want to help when people are in desperate need, like they are after natural disasters. That cooperation will occur where it might normally wouldn't. And he expects us, to accept these constraints, that we would feel the same way, that our constraints would be that we view natural disasters in the same way, that they would bring about cooperation and bring out the best in humanity. But what if we didn't feel that way? What if our constraint is that politicians are greedy, you know what's, and seeing a former president pledging to donate $500,000 to rebuild this bridge, it makes us think of all kinds of horrible things like, oh, he's just doing it for the publicity, he doesn't really care, things like that. It's not going to have the same type of effect on us as it would someone who shared the author's constraints, right? But you would have to figure out your own constraints, right? All we have here on the trace analysis is the author's constraints. You can talk about your own constraints, and you can also kind of guess, right? You can venture a guess, an educated guess at what other audiences might be constrained by. And then the exigence. What caused this image to even happen? Well, the president is lending aid to the Haitians after a devastating earthquake occurred. That's all we need to know about the exigence, right? So as you can see, granted this was a photo, so it's just one image. There's not much to it. So a trace analysis for that visual is very brief, right? We're just trying to understand the foundation of the argument at this point. Okay. So the next slide asked you to read a very short essay called A is for Absent by Chris Piper. Hopefully you did read it. And then it offers a trace analysis of that as well. So now we can see how a trace analysis would look with a written argument. So again, you'll notice it's pretty brief. This is not in-depth stuff right here. So the text for A is for Absent. It's an argumentative editorial, appeared in the school newspaper. It provides reasons and personal experience to show that professors should not have attendance policies that can lower a student's grade for excessive absences. And I don't know, for those of you who have attended other types of schools, you may have encountered this type of attendance policy elsewhere. We don't do it here at ATA really. I've never done it. I've always thought, you're allowed a certain number of absences per school policy. I'm not going to add anything onto that, and I'm not going to, mess with your grade over absences. If you're absent and you can still get a good grade in my class, good for you. More than likely, though, you're going to get the lower grade for the absences anyway. So that's kind of what we're talking about here is attendance policies in addition to the one that the school itself sets forth. And they're usually attendance policies that will lower your grade if you miss so many classes. All right, so it's an argumentative editorial from the school newspaper because where it's based on his own experience of receiving a lower grade in a class based on excessive absences, and he is trying to prove that that should not be allowed. Who is the reader? Who's the intended audience? Other students probably, first and foremost, who either have experienced this as well or could possibly, but you could also think, okay, so if his intended audience is other students, his classmates, his schoolmates, what good would that really do? Aren't most of them gonna agree with him anyway? So are we just venting, right? Are we just commiserating? So who, if he wants something to be done, if he thinks that it shouldn't be allowed for professors to, have these kinds of policies, who is really his intended reader? Probably the professors and other school administrators, right? The people who have the authority to change the policies. So I would say that's his primary audience, are the people who could make a change. to the system. Who is he? Well, he is a sophomore majoring in communications. He had good grades on all of his tests and all of his projects, but he lost 10 points due to absences and ended up with a C. He's also a proofreader for the college newspaper where this is, where the article is appearing. Maybe that could lend to his credibility, right? He has this job, he's a proofreader for the newspaper, reliable, studious, observant, right? As a proofreader, you got to catch a lot of errors, right? So that might help influence how we react to him. Constraints. So the author's constrained, if you read, remember that part of the article, the editorial, he kind of likens the students to paying customers, and that they are essentially, through tuition, paying the professor for their services, and that they should be able to take advantage of those services on their own terms. I'm paying you, so I should be able to come and go as I please and still get the grade I earned based on the work I do, not how often I show up to class. I'm the customer's always right. He's also constrained by the idea that students can learn enough on their own and without having to go to class every day or however often it meets. And he expects the readers to hold those same beliefs. Now, one other constraint he has that kind of influences how he, approaches the argument is he does understand that, professors do have a right to determine their grading policy. He understands, to a certain extent, why they would institute additional attendance policies. But overall, he's more constrained by his own experience. The exigence, what caused this argument to occur in the first place? He got a C in the class simply for excessive absences. And it says that he, he lost 10 points, which brought him to a C. So it sounds like he would have received a B in the class. From what I'm gathering from that. So he got knocked down at least one letter grade simply for being absent too many times, despite good grades on everything else in the class. That's what caused this argument to occur. So again, even though this is a longer piece than just one visual image, just one photo, it's still a very brief analysis. We are not getting into a lot of fine details about the argument. So keep that in mind. The next slide takes us through the process of using a trace analysis as the author. So when you go to start creating your own argument, how can you use this exercise to your advantage? And you kind of go backwards a little bit. We go AirCat instead of trace. It's a little backwards and mixed up. The first thing we look at when it's our argument, our text, if you will, is the exigence. We have to think first, what is motivating me to address my issue? What has happened or what is still happening in our world or in our culture that makes this issue relevant? What issues or problems or defects are revealed when we look at this topic? And how severe is the problem of the defect? We want to look at all of those things first before we really get into our argument, before we start presenting and creating our argument, because you have to make sure there is exigence. There needs to be relevance. There needs to be a reason why this issue needs to be discussed, right? Then you're going to think about your audience. Okay, I have this issue. I know there's exigence for this argument. Who am I wanting to reach with this argument? Who are my intended readers? Who's my intended audience? Where do they stand on my issue? How can I establish common ground with them? If they disagree with me, will they be willing to change their mind or modify their views? Is that what I want to happen? Probably. And then we look at the constraints. Okay, I know that there's exigence. There's a good reason to have this discussion. I know who I'm directing my argument towards. Now, what constraints might there be here? What things are influencing me as the author, and what things are going to influence my audience that would make them react a certain way to my overall argument or certain parts of my argument? Why am I interested in the issue? Looking at the author. What is my background and experience with this issue? Which of my personal values are involved? What is my purpose? Why do I want to talk about this topic, this issue in the first place? Why am I presenting this argument? What do I want the end result to be? What am I hoping will happen? And what makes me qualified to write about this, right? Then, finally, you think about what you're going to write, how you're going to present your argument. Why am I writing it? Was it an assignment? What final form is it supposed to take? Is it supposed to be an essay? Is it supposed to be an oral presentation? Is it supposed to be a PowerPoint, a podcast, a radio interview? How is this getting put out there to my audience? What kind of style do I want? Do I want adversarial or consensual? Am I looking to persuade people to agree with me, or am I looking to build common ground and come to cooperate, to cooperate and come to a mutually beneficial agreement? How can I build common ground with my readers? How should I organize my points, right? How can I make it more original and interesting and capture my reader's interest? And what type of support should I use? What should I do to help convince people to see things my way? I have these ideas, these reasons why I'm choosing my point of view. How am I going to prove that? How am I going to support it? How am I going to convince my audience to see it my way? And then how should I conclude? So everything there about how to present the argument. So text is a lot easier when you're doing a trace analysis and you are analyzing someone else's argument. When it's your argument, the text becomes pretty involved. You have a lot of questions to think about. But thinking about these little things can be super helpful before you really get into building your own argument. If you have thought about these elements and you have some pretty decent answers, some pretty good ideas about each of these categories, you're going to be in a really good position to start crafting your argument, right? So again, just like doing the trace when you're the reader is pretty brief. It's not a lot of super fine details. Same thing here when you're the author. That text section has quite a few questions you have to answer, but for the most part, it's still very brief, and we're still very much circling around the argument at this point. So when you think about the rhetorical situation, for this class, for academic essays, the text is your essay, maybe a speech, maybe a presentation, maybe a PowerPoint. Who is the reader? The instructor, and your peers. Even if it's an essay that you're not going to present to the class, you should still always write as if your classmates are part of your audience, right? It's not just your instructor. The author is you, obviously. The constraints will be different in every situation, but they are there. Think about them. Think about what those constraints might be for you and your audience. The exigent is the assignment itself, right? The product that you're being asked to produce and get a grade for. So think of every assignment as a rhetorical opportunity, right? And every one of them has those elements circling around it. So think about them and they will point you in the right direction, help you do even better on that assignment. So thinking still about academic essays, you are expected to do certain things in an academic essay, in an academic argument that you're not always going to find in common everyday argument, even like advertising and art and media. You have to go deeper, basically. We want your arguments to be revelatory, not familiar. Argument in popular culture, it tends to repeat very familiar and overused points. Nothing new is really brought to the table. You want to reveal previously unseen layers and ideas, right? You want to bring something new, something unique to the table about this issue or about this topic. We want logic, not emotion. A lot of argument in pop culture involves emotion. Advertising draws heavily on all different kinds of emotions, but still emotion. Um, Emotion, it's not like it's outlawed in academic essays, but you do want to use it sparingly. You want to focus more on logic, okay? And we're going to learn about how to use emotion and logic and character as a way of supporting an argument. We'll learn about that throughout the quarter. We want analysis, not packaging. We don't want everything just crammed in together in this nice little package, right? We don't want slogans. We don't want trite expressions. We want analysis. We want you to unpack those ideas and explore the argument more fully, the layers of it. And we want inclusion, not exclusion. You know, argument in pop culture is always about us versus them or excluding different groups of people, and it's becoming even more prevalent today. And I think social media has a lot to do with that. It creates a lot of division, and the media is even guilty of it. We don't want to do that in academic argument. We want to address a wider audience and we want to invite everybody in, right? We want to appeal to a larger group of readers, a larger audience than what a lot of pop culture arguments do. So there's a lot that's expected of you in an academic argument, but you guys can do it. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to be looking first at basic analysis or of argument using that trace analysis. Then we're going to start learning more about all the different elements of an argument, all the different parts of an argument, how to identify them in someone else's argument, and then how to create them, how to use those elements in making our own argument. But rhetoric is the foundation of it. And knowing how people are persuaded, the art of persuasion, helps us understand any type of argument 100 times better. If you have any questions about any of the information presented, if you have anything you want to comment on about the Clinton photo or the A is for absent essay, feel free to shoot me an email or something like that. Otherwise, you guys are free to go ahead and move on to the next item in the weekly module.